So in this presentation, we're looking at the last part of paper 1, section B. It's the writing section. For many of us, it's the section that we actually seem to do better on. It's the one that we feel more comfortable with. And because of that, lots of students tend to do this section first and then go on to section A. There is absolutely nothing wrong with students doing that at all, and it also makes sense in a way because it will help you with your timings, because if you give yourself the full 45 minutes to answer this question as opposed to overrunning on section A and not leaving yourself enough time to answer this particular question. So the assessment objectives for this one, you actually get 2, but you're marked for both as well. So assessment objective 5 is by far the biggest one. It's where you communicate clearly, effectively and imaginatively, selecting and adapting tone, style and register for different forms, purposes and audiences. So the first part of that is just making sure that what you're writing comes across as clear. Is it understood? Do I know what's happening? And the imaginative part is, again, can you really build up a really nice description or tell a really interesting story? Can you adapt the tone and style and register for the different audiences? In every question you'll get, there will be a different audience to consider. And if you can get that bit right, you can get lots of marks. You also need to organise information ideas using structural and grammatical features to support the coherence and cohesion of texts. So how well is your whole story organised? Is it logical? Does it make sense? And if you can get all of those things right, it's worth 24 marks. The last 16 marks out of the possible 40 is vocabulary, sentence structures for purpose and effect with accurate spelling and punctuation. It isn't just spelling. It's about how well you can use sentence structures. Can you paragraph for effect? Can you have good spelling, obviously, but can you also use punctuation correctly and can use punctuation for effect? So there's a number of marks on offer here for students, and they can do particularly well if they consider all of these things. So the first thing I want to talk about before we even look at the questions is plan, plan, plan. As an examiner myself, one of the things we are desperate to see whenever we open up booklets to mark is that we see a plan written down. And the plan can be really short. It can be a spider diagram. It can be just numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Just give me a brief idea about what's going to be in each paragraph. It does 2 things. The first thing is it helps structure your own writing so that it makes sense to the examiner. There's nothing worse than reading a story as an examiner and you know the student hasn't planned it, because about halfway through it will take a really weird turn, or it will suddenly have this unusual things occur because the students run out of ideas of what to put in there. There's nothing worse than reading a story like that. Having a simple plan at the beginning helps structure your ideas. More importantly though, even though we don't mark the plan, you're showing me what you're going to be doing. So when we talk about structure a bit later on, you're going to be showing me how you're changing the structure of your piece of writing. Where are you changing the focus? Is there a flashback going to be occurring in this scene? You're almost identifying for me parts that I should be looking out for. You're making my job easier, and in a sense that's a great thing because I'll be looking out for it as I mark it. So this is a question you've seen before. As you can see, you're always given on section B of paper 1, you're given 2 options. The first one, you're given a picture. Write a description suggested by this picture. It's really important that you understand that word suggested by this picture. You do not have to write about this picture particularly. It can spark off ideas. This picture could be the beginning of your story, the middle of your story, the end of the story. It could make you think about another train journey in severe weather. Essentially, it's just to spark your imagination. It isn't to limit you in any way, shape or form. The other thing that's important there, you'll notice that it says write a description. If you look at the second question, or write the opening part of a story about a place that is severely affected by weather. They are 2 very different skills. Writing a description, the description must be the focus. So I've got to be able to see the place clearly. Whereas when you're writing a story, I need to have the opening of a story. I need to be seeing a story that begins, is logical, we have characters involved. However, I want the description in it. So what I've been teaching my students to do is, if you're writing a description, put some story elements in there to help the story, to help the description along, to keep it interesting, as opposed to just saying there is a train, there is a big wave hitting the train, there are houses in the background that look like rainbows. Put some kind of story to it, but focus on the description. And if you choose to do the story, Make sure the story is interesting and logical, but throw in lots of description as well. Let me really see the characters, the situation, the place, because I can give you lots of marks for it. So yes, it's two different skills, but you can combine them in either question, and that's going to really help you. The other thing to say about this as well is they've been very clear, AQA, you won't always get a description and a story. You could be asked to choose between two stories, or you could be asked a question as two descriptions. That's because the exam board didn't want teachers making sure their kids only learn how to do one type of skill. So that's why you've been being taught how to write a story, but also how to write an interesting description as well. So keep that in mind. You won't always get a description and a story. But that's definitely worth keeping in mind. The last thing I want to talk about is actually right at the very beginning. It's looking at what you're actually doing, who you're writing it for, what form it's going to take. So you're entering a creative writing competition, okay? It doesn't really help us very much, but the next bit does help us. Your entry will be judged by a panel of people of your own age. So we know what we're writing. We're writing a story or a description for people of our own age. So we've got that in mind. So what do people of your age want to be reading about? What's going to entertain them, engage them, keep them interested? Really important, because if you get, as I say, you get the audience right, I can give you extra marks when it comes to AO5. So that's a typical question. So in terms of timing, I've already spoken about this, but you must spend 45 minutes planning and answering this question. My advice would be to spend 5 minutes planning, 5 minutes checking, and spending 35 minutes writing. You won't be able to write a great deal in that time. I don't want you to write a story. In fact, it tells you to write the opening. If you are writing a whole story, you are not going to do very well. No writer who's worth their salt can write a good story in 35 minutes. So all you're thinking about is writing the opening, tempting me into a much bigger story. So absolutely fine to leave it on a cliffhanger. But you must spend 45 minutes on it. And the reason I keep reiterating this is because Section A has a habit of sucking in students and keeping them writing and writing and writing. And when they get to Section B, they look at the clock and there's only 20 minutes left. That is awful. You've got to make sure you give yourself the exact time for this question, which is why lots of students do tend to do it first, because then they give themselves the right amount of time for it. It's worth 50% of the marks of the whole paper, 40 marks out of a possible 80, but more importantly, it's worth 25% of your whole English language GCSE. So for a question that we generally tend to do better, why aren't we spending longer doing it? And if you are somebody that hasn't been very good with your timings, you need to sort this out ASAP. So a couple of things to talk about. When I am marking a piece, I'm looking for how you're using language, how you can manipulate language and structure. So you'll remember this slide. This slide comes from the language presentation that I did a few weeks ago. And in this one, I'm just going to the types of things. This is what I'm looking out for. I'm looking for interesting word choice. I don't want boring nouns and verbs. I want really interesting adjectives and adverbs. I would much rather a student write me a side and a half of well thought out prose than 6 sides of stuff that's just been rushed through. Think about your word choices. Is that the best possible word you could have used? Do I need another adjective? Do I need to start a sentence with an adverb as opposed to starting with I all the time? Think about these choices because they're going to make a massive difference to your score. When it comes to descriptive techniques, as you can see on here, both visual and for sound, these are imperative. I need you to be using similes, personification and metaphor, because how are you going to show me the place that you're setting the story or the description without these things? I need you to be using sound, onomatopoeia, alliteration, sibilance. I need the 5 senses. I don't just want to see this description. I want to see it, feel it, touch it, smell it. I want to get all those senses, and you can do that by using some of these techniques here. But don't forget about some of the interesting rhetorical devices: lists, repetition, rhetorical questions, exaggeration, hyperbole. All of these things you can use in your writing to really enhance it and bring it out. And also think about the simple things like punctuation. Should this sentence have an exclamation mark? Should there be a question mark? What about ellipsis? Not just ellipsis at the end of the passage or the end of your story, but ellipsis halfway through. And then think about sentence types: short sentences, fragmented sentences, compound, complex. And you can also think about structure. Think about going back to the PowerPoint we did on structure. Where's your change of focus going to come in? Are you going to have one sentence paragraphs, one word paragraphs? Are you going to shift in time? We're going to have a flashback anywhere. You want to bring everything in. All the stuff you've been looking at in section A, you want to be using in section B, both language and structure. And if you're using structure elements, you're going to be getting extra marks, because I guarantee so many students won't even be thinking about those structure elements. They'll be going straight away into their stories. So an AQA tip that is important is they have told schools that they want to see the writer's methods that you've been identifying in section A in your own work. And this is where you need to think about being a magpie and borrowing ideas from a passage in section A. You have got a piece of work or a piece of writing written by an author who is celebrated, who is successful in their craft, and AQA are telling you to use ideas and spark some imagination from what's written there. What a wonderful opportunity. You want to write something, you want to make sure you're getting lots of different language techniques in it. You've got a piece of writing in that exam paper just to quickly flick back to and go, oh, actually, that's a really good idea. Look, that was a really good simile. I'm not going to use that exact simile, but I'm going to make sure I put one in about the weather to describe the way the wind is blowing against the carriage, for example. So if you've got a piece of writing to look back on, why wouldn't you use it? It makes absolutely no sense. And as I said, as an AQA examiner myself, I will be looking for any language and structural features that you include in your writing. And when you do include them, I'm going to be giving you marks for it. So I want you to be definitely using them in your writing. So here's a second question. This one comes from the Brighton Rock paper. Your school or college is asking students to contribute some creative writing ideas for its website. So now we know the audience, it's going to be pupils your age, but it's also going to be parents as well. So that's important. And it's for a creative writing task. So it's designed to be fun and interesting and engaging. So we're not limited there by the audience or the form. There's a lot we can write about. So the first one, write a description suggested by this picture. Okay. So there we have a picture in the background there, and again it's just suggested. You don't have to use this complete image and say everything about it. It can spark off something else. It could just be about beach or the town in the background or the people that inhabit it, but it's just there to spark your imagination. Or describe an occasion when you have felt unsure or challenged. Focus your thoughts and feelings you had at the time. One thing to really point out here, it doesn't have to be real. You can make something up for the purposes of this question, so it doesn't have to be a real thing. If you have a real thing to describe, fine, but if you haven't, then you can write about that. And as you can see, both are descriptions. There's not a story question here, so remember what I said earlier, be prepared for that. So here's the mark scheme. I've only shown you what you need to get the top marks for content and organisation. But as you can see here, if you look on the left hand side, what you're looking for to get into those top marks, content is convincing and crafted, whereas organisation is structured, developed, complex and varied. If you look at the right hand side, if we look at just at the upper level 4, so we're looking at the best, this is what I'm looking for an examiner. So is the communication, is it convincing and compelling throughout? So do I believe the narrative voice? Do I believe the story? Am I invested? Do I want to turn the page to get onto the next page because I want to keep reading it? Does the tone, style and register match the purpose, form and audience? Do you manipulate? Is it subtle, increasingly abstract? Can you play around with ideas? Extensive and ambitious vocabulary with sustained crafting of linguistic devices. That one's a really important one for me. This is the difference between students writing 6-page stories and those that are writing side and a half, 2 sides, are really thinking about every single detail, because it's those students that are going to be more successful in the day. In terms of the organisation, highly structured and developed writing incorporating a range of integrated and complex ideas. Think about flashbacks, for example, change of focus, all the things you've looked at for structure, that's what it's talking about here. Fluently linked paragraphs with seamlessly integrated discourse markers. Again, I don't want to see sentences start I see too much of that. It's about using variety. Can you think about different ways of starting your sentences, different way of starting your paragraphs? This is where fragmented sentences comes in and comes really useful. And varied and inventive use of structural features. Again, I'm really sick and tired of reading stories that start with someone sitting at home in their bedroom and then their friends call for them and then they go out. So many stories, regardless of what they're doing, start that way. Start with a flashback. Start with a moment of action. Start with something exciting. Make me confused at the beginning and then make it clearer as we go on. If you think about some of the best films you've seen, they don't start with just two people sitting in a room and having dialogue with each other, unless you're a Tarantino film. They start with moments of action. They start with lots of things happening. They start with dialogue that's really engaging. You think, well, who are these people? What's going on? They start with a flashback. Start with something interesting, because I guarantee if you grab my interest at the beginning, I'm going to want to keep reading as it goes on. So what I want to show you here is actually a piece of work from a student that was done, not in this school but in another school, but this is an example, and what's surprising about this is the amount of marks that it got. So when I read this through, before I saw the actual marked one, I gave this a really low mark. For me, this was all in level 1. This was 3 marks, 4 marks for the content, 2 or 3 marks for spelling, punctuation, grammar. Have a quick read through of this page and then read through the next page, and then we'll have a look at the examiner's comments. So as you can see, it's really short. Just take the time to finish off reading it. But as you can see here, yes, it is mostly in level 1, but this student gets 8 marks for the content and the organisation, and they get 8 marks for their spelling, punctuation and grammar. So in total, this student got 16 marks out of 40. Now that's not that good still. 16 marks out of 40, maybe a level 3, grade 3, we don't know yet. But this student has barely written anything. The story, if you can call it that, isn't a description. There's hardly any description here at all. It's very basic. There's nothing exciting here whatsoever. Yet this student still managed to get 16 marks out of 40. This should show you that for many of you, achieving a level 3 and above should be incredibly easy, as long as you plan, you include structural and language features. There shouldn't be any problem at all. Now on the next few slides, I'm not going to do much talking. I haven't included the whole of this. This was about 3 pages long. I've just included the first page and a half. The first thing I want to draw your attention to is this student here has started with a plan. And as you can see, you've got overall description, sights and smells, focus on a person, focus on a second person, description of buildings, finish off. This student has signposted for me that they have used structural techniques. What's great about that is now I'm looking for them and I know I'm going to be marking for them. You need to be putting these little plans in at the beginning. So have a quick read through this opening here. This student has taken the picture and actually has decided to stay with the picture and just the picture itself and describe what's going in there. However, even though it is a description, there is little bit of a story behind every paragraph, behind every interaction. There's a small story, and I really like what the student's done with this here. So just continue to read it through. You can see hopefully where the students use lots of nice different language features to really bring it out. The spelling is very good. The vocabulary is not particularly the most ambitious, if I'm going to be honest. However, for me, it's still going to be a level 4 response. So have a read through this page. And this is the last page here. It does go on for about another side, but generally you get the gist. It's not huge. It doesn't go on forever, but it does everything I need. As an examiner, I'm ticking almost every single line on this piece of work. So by the time I get to page 2, halfway through page 2, this student already in my mind is top level 3, already breaking into level 4. And the thing about the writing question on the mark scheme is we are awarding for what is there. We are not awarding for what's not there. Simply put, if a student is breaking into level 4, that does one thing, one bullet point in level 4, that student needs to get a level 4 mark. And that's really important. So you need to be looking at what you can do to get into those top marks. So what can we do for a bit of revision? Well, there are no revision packs on Go for Schools, so what we can do is this. What I'd like you to do is to pick one of these images or all of these images. It's really up to you and how much revision you want to do. And I'd like you to write a description that is suggested by one of these images. Okay, time yourself, give yourself 45 minutes and then bring it in for English teacher to mark. So for this one, write a description suggested by one of these 4 images. And if you don't want to do the description one, well, here's some question ones. You've got some story ones here. Write the opening part of a story titled Freedom. Write the opening part of a story titled Murder in Paris. Write about a time when you had to face a fear. And write the opening of a part of a story titled Machine. You've got 4 story ones there. So what I'd like you to do is pick one of them or all of them and write them up in 45 minutes and give them to your teachers to mark. And remember, before we finish off, if you're writing a story, make sure the story is the focus of your work, but include lots of description and structural features to really flesh it out. And if you're writing a description, put elements of a story in there to keep this thing going, to make it interesting for the reader. Don't just describe what you can see, but remember the description is the most important part there. So just be aware of the distinction between the two. Good luck.